And now we will have a discussion. And I would like to invite Professor Manoranjan Mohanty. Professor Mohanty is a teacher, researcher, and writer, a political scientist, China scholar, and peace and human rights activist. He has many books and research papers on theoretical and empirical dimensions of social movements, human rights, development studies, and global transformation. After retiring from the University of Delhi, he has been with the Council for Social Development, CSD, and is the editor of the CSD journal Social Change, published by Sage. Please, Professor Mohanty.
Thank you, Professor Wan, for a brilliant, you said, teamwork under your leadership. And yes, and it's a great contribution to modern political economy analysis in the era of capitalism in the post-Second World War period, right up to the pandemic. My greetings from Delhi. And I'm very close to the farmers' movement, both politically and physically. Therefore, it's a great coincidence that when a rural reconstruction group is reporting to the world their great achievements in building alternative development process, here the farmers' movement is celebrating 6 months of its agitation on the Delhi borders. Demanding repeal of 3 anti-farmer laws, but it's really questioning the development pattern. And in March, April, when they had a march coinciding with the 90th anniversary of Mahatma Gandhi's Dandi March of 1931, this became very clear because workers, peasants, progressive intellectuals, civil liberty workers, feminist movements from all over the country joined the march from different parts of India. So it's a great coincidence that we are discussing really the Sannung perspective on how to understand the crisis from the viewpoint of the countryside and the peasants, people, and how to also find solutions. Thank you, Professor Wan. Last 20 years, we have been watching all your works, and I appreciate your many presentations in India during the last 15 years. And I look forward to the studies published by the entire group which studied the 5 or 7 countries under the Global South Knowledge Network. And I think this is a meeting of pathfinders. And Professor Wan has spelled out how the path which was propelled by colonialism and then after the Second World War by Western capitalist countries has been now challenged. And in fact, the last chapter, the 5th chapter of the book, discussing the pandemic also very in great detail, explains it in a great way. In fact, I believe that the pandemic is a milestone in challenging the colonial, neo-colonial, hegemonic, and capitalist development pattern from the industrial revolution of capitalism and elitist Western and European model right up to today. As we have been hearing in the West, in some countries where they have overcome the second wave, in India we have just begun to see the decline of the second wave. but we are very concerned about the coming of the third wave. But in the West, already they are talking about business as usual. In other words, to carry on the neoliberal development pattern. And the G7 statement a few days ago from Cornwall summit of the G7 countries very clearly indicated that they want to return to that path, and in the context of a new Cold War confronting China. So that is the context in which Professor WEN Tiejun's study has to be seen. It is a study of the last 70 years, but in the global context. So we get a lot of insights into understanding of global capitalism from this study. Now, there are several points of significance of this study. I think first, unlike many studies, including my own on the 40 years of reforms, my book, China's Transformation, the Success Story and the Success Trap, which is finding it difficult to get a Chinese translation published in China. And many reform studies in China and outside China. Unlike them, this is a 70-year perspective. It's a very important departure. And I congratulate Professor WEN Tiejun for this 70-year perspective and 49 to 2020. It's very interesting. The 10 crises that he talks about are put in the 70-year perspective. First, in terms of the domestic experiences, but always interacting with the global situation, regionally and globally. So the first crisis in the wake of the land reforms of the Korean War, the second to fourth, then the seventh, the fourth to seventh, then eighth and ninth, the two Asian economic crisis of 97 and the 2008 to 2010-11, you can say, the world global financial crisis, and then the current crisis arising out of the contradictions, the three gaps that he talked about, the rural-urban gap, the regional gap, and the wealth gap, income gap, which are growing during the last many years, particularly during the last 10 years. And they all manifested during the pandemic. So the great achievements of China are also explained in terms of the what I call the dynamics of the internal and the external. And in his language, the endogenous factors and the exogenous factors. So the 70-year study is very significant. The explanation for the 20-year period, 58 to 78, is very interesting. All of us, scholars of China, have tried to find some explanations. Before Cultural Revolution was denounced, and during the last many years, also having a relook, giving many new interpretations. But his interpretation is very interesting. Of course, we all knew that use of labor-intensive projects to meet the crisis was the response. But why that was the response? The capital crisis in the wake of the Soviet withdrawal and the isolation that China had suffered. But he explains that is the period when China consolidates her sovereignty as an independent developing country. That is the period when socialism is firmly discussed and Then that is the period when in the 70s, China takes advantage of the geopolitical environment to take Japanese capital and European and particularly American capital, North American capital, American, Canadian, and so on, and Southeast Asian, of course, to have these the second major wave of industrialization. So that period is explained very well, and that's a very important contribution of this book, the explanation for the 58-76 period, which we have seen mainly discussed in political and cultural terms, organizational terms, and not in economic crisis and response. The explanation for the very important 10 crises uses very important theoretical framework. And that framework is explained very well, the theory and method, in this book. And the team is a wonderful team. I envy Professor One. We have tried to do some research in Orissa and at the national level through the Creative Theory Colloquium Group, but nowhere as intensive, as focused, as sustained, using both theory and empirical work as this team has done for the last 20 odd years. Now, political economy framework, Marxist political economy framework, enriched by Wallerstein, core periphery, and Samir Amin, dependency theory, and very importantly, the unique socio-economic political history of China in this case, and methodologically suggesting that you have to find the local knowledge systems and how ecology, economy, culture, all of them interact. Now that theoretical framework is extremely important. So the political economy framework plus institutional economics, and that is a clear contribution of this model, this study, namely the theory of transfer of cost of industrialization. The colonial powers transferred it to colonies. If you go by the three worlds thesis, the first world depended on the second world and the third world. And China had a unique experience because it was forced at that time, because it couldn't engage in any external, that is outside China, transfer of cost of its industrialization. So the urban cost was transferred to the rural. And this is something which is very close to some suggestion which Barrington Moore had made about both Soviet industrialization as well as Chinese industrialization, how the peasantry financed industrialization. But this formulation, the cost transfer formulation, goes much beyond and explains in great detail. And in this, how many more minutes I have, Jed? 5
maybe
minutes?
5 minutes? Yeah, 5 minutes.
Okay. In fact, this will help us to understand Xi Jinping's new era policies and the way China is currently responding to the various social, economic, and ecological crises. Now, the ecological civilization and emphasis with great financial investment on the local is not just a slogan, because we have had slogans even under Deng Xiaoping about not only material civilization but also spiritual civilization. Then towards the end, political civilization, and now and in between, of course, cultural civilization, and now ecological civilization. No, it is not that. And this is why sustainability that the Global University uses and the sustainability that I'm afraid United Nations also talks about, but not in that comprehensive term, But the sustainability or the ecological civilization that Professor WEN Tiejun suggests is far more than the traditional ecology or the environmental concept of sustainability. It's far more. It has political, economic, cultural, and ecological, that means in environmental terms. So here, ecological is a very important ecological civilization, not only just policies, ecological civilization. It is raised to a civilization level. And therefore, beautiful country is no longer a slogan in China, though many people still believe it is. It is a much deeper thing. And in this context, I will ask three questions to all of us and Professor Wang to consider, because for him, the transfer is from one space to another, Europe to colonies and so on, urban to rural, but both urban and rural are differentiated in terms of class and gender and ethnicity. And unfortunately, in the space-focused development program under Chinese policymakers, including, I noticed in the 14th five-year plan, it was there in the 13th plan also, and Professor Wang's thesis also, I think the differentiated, the socio-economic differentiation, how labor is effectively affected. Labor is the, whether it is industrial labor, unorganized labor, migrant labor, or rural labor. And then in China, countryside is now highly differentiated. Some rich who are both in the urban and rural, and middle class, urban and rural. Then you have poor peasants, and then women left behind, and so on. Therefore, first point, and in the West also, you have poor. In the so-called colonial countries, you have the two cities in the same colonial country, in the metropolis. So we have to build in the class, gender, race, ethnicity, particularly minority ethnicity context to this analysis. This is the first question. The second, I think capitalism, no doubt, is in the financial stage now. But I think together with financial capitalism, the high-tech, artificial intelligence, and so on, capitalism has a focus on incorporating the elites of the third world, Afro-Asian Latin American countries.
It's 19 hours.
Also into globalization process. That challenge, the collaborators of capitalism, just like compradors in the old colonial sense, we have the similar kinds of exploiters in all our countries. Therefore, I will conclude by saying that today, the new Cold War situation is forcing China and India also to follow the path of the Western industrial capitalist model, even though the popular movements and even elements in the leading party in China or many parties and many social movements in India, they share the alternative thought. They share the ecological civilization and the Swaraj perspective, the Ubuntu self perspective, the mutuality of each entity right down to the grassroots, how they have to be self-determined, self-governed, sustainable, just, and ecologically civilized. Therefore, I think the challenge is to see the new modern characteristics of capitalism. And this is what the group, together with Professor Wang, is grappling with, I know, and I hope our discussion, particularly this community of pathfinders, the South-South Forum for Sustainability, will surely look for ways to lead us further. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Mohanty. And now, thank you very much. And the next discussion will be Professor Beverly Silver. Professor Beverly Silver is a professor in the Department of Sociology and director of the Arrighi Center for Global Studies, Johns Hopkins University. Her research focuses on problems of development, labor, social conflicts, and war, using comparative and well-historical methods of analysis. By recasting these issues in a broad geographical and long-term historical framework, her work teases out patterns of recurrence, evolution, and true novelty in contemporary process of globalization. Please, Professor Beverly Silver.
Thank you very much for the. I'm extremely happy to be here. I've been looking forward to the publication of this work in English for almost a decade now. Professor Wen was, along with Professor Sam Moyo from Zimbabwe, was our inaugural speakers when we began the Arrighi Center a decade ago. And then more recently, we had a delegation from the New Rural Reconstruction Movement come for a workshop at the Arrighi Center, where the subtitle of the workshop was Learning from the Local and the Global. And we brought together those community and university organizations within Baltimore, and to share and learn from the New Rural Reconstruction Movement experience in China. This book comes at an incredibly important time in English. This publication in English comes at an incredibly important time. It's a very rich historical and global analysis of the current crisis, put in, again, a historical and global perspective. It's a really important reading, very generative to understanding the present as a particular period of historical capitalism, but it's a very important, I think, also because, again, its publication in English is extremely important at this time, because it also provides a perspective of the current historical movement as seen from China. And this is something that certainly in the United States is missing, and we desperately need. And I certainly will do everything I can to promote the reading of the book in the United States and the discussing of this book, because I think it's pretty key to changing the conversation. I think there's a sense that the terms of the conversation need to be changed throughout the world, but certainly particularly in the United States. And I think this book provides an opportunity to do that. One thing that I think is particularly important, and that fits with the theme of the South-South Conference, is that it combines a sense of urgency or danger about the current historical moment that we're in, but it also has a politics of hope. It also has a proposal of an alternative way forward out of the current impasse, out of the current period of extreme danger that we're in. So the book, sees 2020 as the end of an era. 2020 is the end of multiple errors too, but I mean eras. One is, the crisis of globalization. So it's in a sense that the end of something, neoliberal globalization, this period taking off in the 80s or 90s. So it's something of the last 20, 30 years, but it's also a crisis of the long 20th century of US world power. It's also a longer term crisis, as the book lays out a crisis of modernization, and then an even longer term crisis of the extroverted and ecologically unsustainable Western-led model of development. So one key critique in the book, one key point that comes out over and over again in the book is that the Western development model, Europe and the United States, was an extroverted model that externalized the costs of capitalist development to the rest of the world, and that this is not something that is possible, certainly not desirable, but also just not possible for China to do, and that for China to liberate itself, it actually has to develop an alternative path forward for the world as a whole. So this is, I think, is a super important and exciting argument within the book and the work in general. I want to say that one thing again, and there's so much that could be discussed. So I'm just picking on a few themes, but is this question of who makes the rules, the rulemaking, and the question of the changing of the rules. So it's clear that again throughout the book they emphasize that the United States, particularly in this period, is the rule maker, and that the thing is that the rules have not stayed the same over the period since the Second World War, that we've actually had what might be considered like three different periods. One is immediately after the Second World War, which is the period of the general promotion of industrialization and developmentalism. And it was something that led to a crisis in the 1970s. And the outcome of the crisis of the 1970s was when other countries began to catch up to the United States and then the Western Europe in terms of industrialization, that the US abandoned the promotion of industrialization and shifted to globalization. So we have the shift from developmentalism to globalization, and then the book's emphasis on the shift now when the globalization model, and in particular China's role in the globalization model, has gone from something that's beneficial to US power and profits to something that's a challenge to US power and profits. So they identify the period of the 90s up till early 21st century as this one where China's acceptance into the globalization regime was based on being able to provide cheap commodities, cheap credit, and this externalization, including of the of industrial pollution, and that already in 2000 there were some questions, but by 2008, with the pivot, the so-called Obama pivot to East Asia and the TPP, and then now, even in a more extreme form, the globalization model, which had been benefiting the United States and in a sense, reflated or restored US power after the crisis of the 1970s, that by the last decade, it actually was undermining US power again. And so the United States and the West in general is abandoning this globalization project for a new Cold War and a kind of credit some again, and I want this question of let me just say here that the question of debt is something that comes out. I think that another through theme, in other words, a theme that is carried throughout the book is this theme about debt, both internal, the national debt within China, and then the global financial circuits and the US debt. And I think as I was reading, one thing that, came to mind is the old saying that, if you owe a small amount of money, then it's the problem of the debtor. If you owe a large amount of money, then it's the problem of the creditor. And so this is the situation where the United States has this enormous unsustainable debt, a lot of it held by China, and exactly how this model that's dependent on a continuous inflow of surplus capital from all around the world can be sustained. The economic foundations of it are collapsing, and the military foundations of it are the temptation of using the military foundations is extremely strong back for the US, but will lead to disaster for the world. I want to just, I think, end with a couple of comments. I think, again, just to go back to one of the things that I started with is that if you look, at the two main actors in terms of source of catastrophe or avoiding catastrophe. One is, the US and more generally Western resistance to relative decline and the inability to break out of dependence on a particular developmental path that, again, this extroverted, ecologically unsustainable development path that's also heavily extroverted economically, but also extroverted from a military point of view. And so the first, is a campaign which I've been, talking about for a long time now, to stop this new Cold War, to avoid this new Cold War, to move away from it, to change the dynamic of the conversation to one where there's an acceptance of a smooth transition to a more equal distribution of wealth and power in the world. It requires a major cultural transformation within the United States in terms of the discussion. And that's where, again, I'm extremely happy that this book is now available in English, because I think it will contribute to our efforts to move this kind of discussion forward, and also to be, to kind of be able to see that there's also a perspective from China, that's where many of the same facts look quite different, right? And so I'd like to allow the people in the English-speaking who are English-speaking readers to see and understand this alternative point of view. The last thing that I'll say is again on the politics of hope, because it's actually the politics of hope in this book it's not, sometimes it's just tacked on at the end because people don't want to write something terribly depressing. So they tack on, in fact, I'm guilty of this. I'll tack on something hopeful at the end, but it doesn't really follow from the analysis. Here, both the danger, but also the hope follows from the analysis in the sense that this pro-people creative ecological civilization is something that has historical roots. It's not something that just comes out of the thin air, and it has, kind of a base to it, both above and below, in terms of support for it. And it kind of provides a, as I think I already mentioned, that it's not so much China as a model to be emulated, but more China as opening up a path that solves this crisis for itself, but also shows a different potential developmental path out of the ecologically destructive, unsustainable, and military-based development of capitalism over the last several centuries. So I think I'll end there. Again, congratulations on the publication of the book in English, and I really look forward to it sparking a fruitful and positive change in direction in the conversations that we're now having, particularly in the United States. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Beverly Silver. And the third discussant is Remy HERRERA. Professor Remy HERRERA is an economist and researcher at the National Center for Scientific Research at the University of Paris I, Panthéon-Sorbonne, France. He is associate with the Union of Radical Political Economics in New York, the International Initiative for Promoting Political Economics in London, the Latin American Society for Political Economy in São Paulo, in Brazil, the National Association of Economists of Cuba in Havana, and the Third World Forum in Dhaka. Please, Professor Remy HERRERA.
Thank you. Do you hear me? Do you hear me? It's okay? Okay. So good evening or good afternoon all. I'd like to start by thanking deeply the organizers of this new forum, Kinchi, Jade, Yan, Lai, Dai, Xiaomei, all the team, Erebus, all the team of the Lingnan University and also of the Global University. So this is wonderful to see how hard they are working for the collective. So thank you deeply for that. This is so important to have you. Of course, many thanks to Professor Wen for his work in general and for this book in particular, because this is a masterpiece. This is a wonderful book, an intellectual and scientific tool for understanding the contemporary history of China, economic, political, social history of modern China. He analyzes in depth, he analyzes in a wonderful manner. So for me, it's a very, very important book. And in fact, reading this book was so important to me that it inspired a part of my researches devoted to China and especially those that I carry out in collaboration with Long Jiming, who is now become a professor at Tsinghua University in Beijing. So we have, together with Jiming, we have been working together for several years, and in one of our studies, we tried to verify Professor Wen's 10 crisis thesis. And this work is available, it is published in scientific journals in economics, and in a very short and accessible version in an issue of the monthly review, in an article entitled The Enigma of China's Growth of 2018, I believe. I remember it. I don't remember exactly, but I believe it's that October 2018. And our results, which have been obtained by, let's say, another method, or a formalized and technical economic analysis, confirm, in fact, do confirm the existence of 10 crises, exactly as highlighted by Professor WEN Tiejun in the economic history of the People's Republic of China since 1949, or rather since 1952, that is to say, since the creation of the National Bureau of Statistics of China. So over the past decades, the success of Chinese economy can be illustrated, as we know, by a very rapid GDP growth rate, probably the highest in the world on average, over the last 3 or 4 decades. This success can be explained by many factors. We identified physical capital accumulation, infrastructural investment, educational investment, R&D, and for sure also the key role of the peasantry and the transfer from the peasantry to industry, to the industrial sectors. And we observe these factors on the long period, because some of these factors, because we have built using official data, I mean using NBS available data, but rebuilt some of these indicators. We rebuilt new series of physical capital stock, of human resources stock, and also of R&D spending. And you can have this data, these new chronological data in the China Economic Review, or in a new book we have published in France some months ago, some weeks ago. So considering the GDP growth rate, how can we spot some moments of crisis, as Professor Wen pointed out? What we can observe since 1952 is the evolution of China's GDP level as appearing as an exponential curve, okay? But they are 4 periods. They are fluctuations of these GDP growth rates with 4 periods of negative GDP growth rate, okay? And these 4 periods taken as a whole amount to 7 years of the 64 years provided by our sample, okay? Going from 1952 to 2015. That was for this work the last year. Okay, so that's about 10% of total time, and these negative value for the GDP growth rate are recorded for 1960 to 1962, corresponding to the rupture with the USSR, 1967 to 1968, that's the beginning of the Cultural Revolution, plus 1976, Mao's death, and finally 1989, that's the Tiananmen protest. Okay, just in a context of upward trend in the GDP growth rate, we can identify these 4 periods of crisis. I mean, crisis understood as periods characterized by a negative GDP growth rate. Okay, that is to say, a decrease in GDP level. But in order to deepen and complexify this concept of crisis, that is to say, in trying to be closer than the analysis, the complex analysis of crisis given by Professor Wen, we choose to use an indicator of surplus rate, or let's say of profit rates. Okay, indicators we have built for China over the long period based on our capital stock series. Okay, and this profit rate indicator represents the ratio of a surplus, or let's say a profit, given by the difference between GDP and the remuneration of the workers, and as a denominator we have the capital stock, the capital advance. Okay, so it's a quite simple, but it's aggregated. Okay, corresponding to all the sectors, not only industrial sectors. Okay, so we have a quite simple indicator, and we proceed to a decomposition of this profit rate or surplus rate, as you want, in long-term trends and short-term cycles. And what can we observe? First, that there is a downtrend in these profit rate indicators over the long period. And secondly, that short-term cycles appears. That is to say, a regular succession of positive and negative changes in the profit rate growth, or if you prefer, to be more precise, in the cyclical components of the of the profit rate indicator. Okay, and we can see where we have recession years. That is to say, when we have negative values in the growth rate in the cyclical components of the profit rate, and we find recession years for 30 years, okay, over the 64 years of the global sample. That is to say, we have negative changes covering a total of almost half the time of the sample. That is to say that, in fact, we have a negative sign for the cyclical component of the profit rate indicator for the years 1952, 1957, from 1960 to 1963, 1968, 1978 to 1982, 1985 to 1987, then 1990, 91, then 1998 to 2003, And after that, the so-called financial crisis, global financial crisis, 2008. Then after, from 2012 to the end, that is to say 2015. So not only 4 periods are identified as previously, that is to say by using the GDP growth rate, let's say only. No, we have now 10 periods. This is the truth. we didn't manipulate the data. That's like that. We found 10 periods with negative values recorded. And these 10 recessive sequences correspond to what Professor Wen called 10 crises in his book. And we can recognize the slowdowns witnessed in China's economic history since the beginning of the revolution, okay, since 1948. That is to say that we find after the war and convulsion of the decades before the victory of the revolution, we found the statistical trace or scar of the recession that began in 1952 and which reached its lowest point in 1957, then the dramatic crisis of the early 60s, the worst under the Maoist era, with the worst point recorded in 1961. Then we have the year 1968 with the hardening of the Cultural Revolution. Then the post-Mao transition and the reforms of openness between 1978 to 1982. Then we have the period from 1985 to 1987, corresponding to the difficulties of implementation of the tax reform at that time, the 1984 tax reform. Very important because it's one of the turning points of the transition towards a market economy. Then we have the post-Tiananmen period at the time of the collapse of the Soviet bloc in 1990, 1991. Okay, and after that, exactly has, I mean, because we could also analyze, but it can take too much time. The amplitude, the importance of the fluctuation of these waves in the changes of the cyclical components of the profit rates. But if we observe that, we can see exactly what Professor Wen pointed out. That is to say that after this time, at the end of the 19th, in a context of China's strong GDP dynamism, we have the declines in the cyclical components of the profit rates from 1998 on, which are increasingly associated with the impact of imported exogenous shocks due to the diffusion, to the dissemination of the effects of regional or even global crises suffered by China. As Professor Wen has described in his book, that is to say, the so-called ASEAN crisis, 1998, 1999, then the new economy and post-September 11 crisis, 2001, 2003, and finally, the so-called subprime financial crisis of 2008, which is in fact, in reality, it's a systemic capitalist crisis and not just a financial crisis, whose effects were felt in China in 2009 and more deeply from 2012 on, that is to say, until today, in fact. In reality, it's until today. So to conclude, I would like to underline a paradox, because these 10 crises are sometimes, I mean, even most often concurrent with high GDP growth, with high GDP growth rates. In other words, growth doesn't necessarily mean absence of difficulties, okay? And conversely, crisis does not necessarily mean a recession in GDP, okay? Because in a country like China with strong contradiction, it seems necessary to use a broader concept of crisis, as Professor Wen did, in order to account for periods in which structural difficulties appear, structural difficulties arise, even through the appearance of a strong GDP growth, suggesting that all is going well. Okay, thus we have chosen to describe as crises these paradoxical periods characterized both by negative variation in the profit rates, or the surplus rates as we have defined it, but at the same time also positive GDP growth rates, and sometimes very high GDP growth rates. So as we can see, and this is my last word, as we can see, the analysis of crises is extremely complex, whether in China or elsewhere. And I congratulate and thank Professor Wen to help us to understand them, thanks to his book, his wonderful book. I love this book. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Remy. Thank you. And we would like to ask if anybody from the panel would say something or comment, because we find friends from Ecuador, from Malaysia, and also from the UK. And
thank you. And first, let me thank you, the organizing team, for all your efforts, and also to thank Professor Wen and his team for the excellent study. I'm not a China scholar, and nor have I read the book, but as I was listening very carefully to his presentation, I thought I would frame the presentation he made slightly differently. I'm not sure I see any economic cycles in the framing of the presentation, but rather I see a lot of political developments and a high degree of pragmatism in response to various challenges which took place over time. The most important thing, of course, is the very nature of the coalition, the political coalition, which created the revolution. It was essentially a coalition from the anti-Japanese resistance and the defectors of the Kuomintang who lost after that, after being rather discredited. And so there was a coalition, and this I think is very, very different from, say, let's say the Bolshevik Revolution. And I think this is important for us to recognize that many of the developments, the 10 major developments which Professor Wen referred to as perhaps rather pragmatic responses to various challenges, domestic as well as international challenges which were being faced. That's first thing. The second thing I would say is that perhaps size matters. The options which are available for China are very different from smaller developing countries all over the world. And so when you have a relatively large population, you have a potentially larger domestic market for consumer products, for instance, and that is possible for China, perhaps for India, perhaps for Brazil, but it's not exactly an option for a country like Ecuador or a whole host of rather smaller countries. The third point I would make is that I really appreciated the distinction which Professor Wen made between on trade and the importance of trade. And also, I think in terms of thinking about trade, the role of international trade before liberation, before 1949, and the fact that many of the choices as far as trade were concerned were, it wasn't as if China chose to delink, or many of these other countries, Cuba chose to delink. They were isolated. Sanctions were imposed against them. And so, I think we run the risk of making a virtue out of a necessity. When you have delinking imposed upon you, we shouldn't turn it around and say that, the only way forward is juche, self-reliance. And this is particularly important for smaller countries, like Cuba is facing so many problems precisely because its options are very, very different from that of China. But the other question, of course, is the treatment of foreign direct investment. And this, of course, is not something which we find, for example, in the work of Hobson or Lenin, in the treatment of imperialism. And how do we understand the role of foreign direct investment and different types of capital accumulation in the modern period? What is the difference of the nationality of ownership? I do think it matters. I do think it matters that Korea, for example, the capitalism which has developed in Korea is nationally owned, whereas what you have elsewhere is not nationally owned. It does make a difference, but I think we need a much more sophisticated and a subtle analysis of this. And my last point is on the question of financialization. If we think about the period which Hobson and Lenin and Hilferding wrote about a century ago, the export of capital was a very important part of imperialism of that time. But where was that capital exported to? It went to the Americas, it went including Argentina and so on and so forth, and to the dominions, to Canada, to Australia, and so on and so forth. So in fact, there was very little capital exported to the bulk of the colonies, and India included. Whatever capital was even the capital which was supposedly British was actually generated from accumulation within those colonies. So I think what is significant about the recent period of financialization and the challenges it poses is actually quite different. It's not really about the dominance of banking capital, for example, but it's rather the dominance of what in financial circles is referred to as market finance and the challenges thereof. And China is now a very significant source of capital. What does that mean in terms of the relations to the rest of the world, including the rest of the developing world? And I think China can play an important role in accelerating the pace of capital accumulation in developing countries. And so I think we really need to think very carefully about the role of capital, including finance, in the present era. But I think, although I'm not a China scholar, I really learned a great deal from listening to Professor Wen, and I want to congratulate his team. And I will look forward to following up on the reference which you gave us Yeah, thank you very much.
I think that I cannot give you a very detailed picture about this, at least 70 years history. And there are so many different reasons of different crises. But something I think that is a key issue I need to re-emphasize. The first that is China is a kind of dual system between rural and urban. Most of our national crisis, economic crisis, including of the social crisis, can be soft landing at the rural. It's because of the first. It's because of the land revolution. Because of most of these peasant households, they are exactly the property owner, means that they can at least have their family life survived by themselves. So think about long-termly, 80 or more than 85% of population live in countryside. And if we think that the crisis taking place into the city because of most of these industries, these factories allocated in cities. So when the modern economic crisis happened, it's happened in the urban area. So if there is no big population in countryside, as a kind of labor pond or labor lake, or even the labor sea, can maintain this surplus labor when they back to the countryside. And they're back to 200 million small peasant households. Every peasant household just maintain maybe one labor. That means the whole of the unemployment problem will be settled. So the first time, the first crisis, I think is extremely important, because in the year 1947, the Chinese Central Party Committee, at that time, is going to take the position in rural area, in urban area. Originally, that in the rural China, they can initiate the revolution joined by the peasants. That is the so-called the countryside around the city. 农村包围城市, I don't know what is exactly translation. But anyway, means that if you initiate the revolution in the countryside, you will have almost no cost or low cost, because the rural people can have their own survival. So you don't need to set up very expensive superstructure politically. So you only rely on the self-governance in the countryside, and then your revolutionary base can be maintained by rural people contribute a little bit properties, and then the whole of this political regime can be survived. So even there's no physical system, they still can be long-termly sustainable exist as a kind of political, not governments, but they are the governments, but not very formal governments. So infrastructure economically and superstructure politically can be applied together as a kind of Communist Party's area. So nowadays, my team started a new work to write the 100 years right economy. Means that this year is a Communist Party 100 years ceremony. So we are trying to contribute another explanation about how does a Red Army or Balujun, means that when fighting with Japanese invaded China, these are 8 years, and also another 4 years fight with old authority. So most of these fightings, you should know that the military fighting is very much expensive. How these areas ruling by the Communist Party can have their economic infrastructure. So there's many stories, many local things. Now we take the materials and trying to summarize and do the analysis. We can finish this this new book in the next part of the year. But what I want to mention is that when we initiate the peasants' revolution, what is the rural people needs? They need the land. So when you claim that equal distribution of the arable land to every household, means that they have a strong willing to join such kind of revolution. But when Communist Party took these big cities like Shanghai, like Guangzhou and Beijing or Tianjin, these big cities, immediately everything need money. Everything need modernize the financial system. When you set up your political regime in the countryside, in rural area, okay, you just rely on these small peasant households. Whatever they contribute, little bit contribute, because it's mass. So you can take little bit from one household to another household, and then at least you can have food. And you live with them, and then you work with them together. So that is a so-called the revolutionary authority. But when you take the big cities, so everything need a budget, need to pay money. That is modernized economy. Immediately, the budget system almost bankrupted because 70% is deficit. So how to solve the problem? By printing this paper money. And then the paper money, large amount of printed out, and then turn to the high inflation. That is the big disaster. And then how does this crisis solved? Because meanwhile, in the whole country, almost all the peasants, they have their piece of land, and then they do have enthusiastic this passion to work hard to create more surplus. And then there is a big buyer, that is state. So the state capital, the state commercial capital, they take almost all of this surplus from small households by the revolutionary army, by the revolutionary authority. So it's more people more easy to believe that you are revolution. And then we contribute, and then we give you my surplus, and then you give your money. So money is inflation money taken by 100 million households, and then the inflation decreased. That is at that time, China hasn't been in monetizing economy, not in so-called financialized economy. So just by the budget, they need to, to solve the problem. So that is the first crisis. I said that it's a soft landing in the first budget deficit crisis, turn to the inflation crisis, soft landing in the countryside. So that's the first time I said it's millions peasants save the country. So we summarize that it's originally that in 1947, when Chinese Communist Party want to set up the nationalist capitalism by the private capitalist, but finally they found it's no way to go. They cannot rely on such kind of force, capitalist force. It's an interest group. They believe their individual interest increase. So they just do very bad things that is not health. It's harmful of the national economy. So that is the beginning. So from another one is that is the so-called the Soviet Union investments for facilitate the Korean War. That is heavy industry. So when you have a heavy industry, you cannot use the heavy industry produce the commercial goods. Only can produce machine. the big products, not for selling to these small peasant households. So that is a contradiction. Urban heavy industry and the rural scattered small economy is a big contradiction. That is dual system. So that is one in the beginning of the 1950s. You cannot just calculate the GDP. It's because that time the whole economy is not easy to be indicated by the GDP system. So that's one way. I mean, especially Mohanty professor, you asked me about the rural people labor. At that time, the whole people joined the work. So there's the people joined the employment, not exactly very formal employment, but people work. Some 80% or 90%. So we just rely on the labor surplus. The labor contribute and then to create big labor surplus, and then to be the capital accumulation. And then there is a kind of national state capital as a kind of state commercial system to take almost all of the agricultural surplus, labor surplus, all created the capital accumulation. That is the 1960s. So when this foreign capital invested into China, turn to the debts, when the state budget system cannot do the investments, you need to mobilize your people. So that is why when Romo said that it's not small country can do. Big country maybe have a big surplus from the population, from the mass, from the big labor force, maybe. Small country have a very little, especially when you take the political superstructure as a kind of colonial master countries. The political system not easy for you to use for mobilize these labors. Like maybe like India. India have a very rich labor force, but cannot use a large number of labor to join the employment and then to create a large number of labor surplus. And maybe you can see that the labor work in the employment, the percentage in India, you compare with China maybe 80%. In the revolutionary period, that is maybe 90%. Even old people, aging people, even children, they all joined revolution, joined the work. That is very different. But if you have no such kind of like Maoism to mobilize, Maoism is a kind of very popular ideology accepted by almost all the labor. So when labor believe Maoism, so Maoism is very easy to mobilize the thousands, millions people to join the construction. So that is a created big surplus. That maybe you can think this is what is capital accumulation by what kind of sources. Sources is a very special factor, and so I said that is caused by the dual system, by large number of the labor can be stored in the countryside, so also can be mobilized to join the construction. So that is when the soft landing, you can rely on the countryside. When you want to have a high growth, you also can mobilize the rural labor to join the construction. So several times, I think that it's the rural China is a kind of urban crisis soft landing base. So that is the basic explanation about this one. So, but after 1990s, because of the 1989 American and Western countries blocked China again, delinking happened again, and then there's no any foreign capital can FDI, foreign direct investments from overseas can flow into China. That is the 1989 to 1993. We have a 4 years depression. It's caused by zero foreign direct investment, and then only can, and also that time Soviet Union collapsed. that is the year 1991. So these are 4 years from 1991 to 92. These are 4 years. It's a big depression, similar as 29 to 33 in the United States or other Western countries. Big depression. These are years to enforce China to join the globalization. Join the globalization means that large number of these low levels industry. It's a commercial goods production workshops from Hong Kong, from Taiwan, and from Singapore, from Malaysia, and South Korea, and so on and so. You should know that just at least 4 years, Malaysia, Singapore, and South Korea all set up a formal diplomatic relation with China in the year 91, 92, 93. So these years, and then they move their, because in these countries, the labor price increased very fast. So they cannot just stand on such kind of high cost. So they move out these labor intensive industries into the coastal area in China. So and absorb a large number of the labor surplus from inland China, move to migrants to the coastal area. So that is make China merge into the globalization from this big depression. So then then immediately China became a kind of one of the member of the globalization club. So and also the American that time in 1993 released the control, not block China, and then China can contribute a lot of low price products. At that time, the price of labor is extremely lower. So because they are originally from the countryside, in countryside they have no cash income because of the depression, and depression also have a kind of very low demand for these agricultural products. So agriculture also fallen into the crisis. So the rural people have no cash income. So when they can have the chance in the coastal China to have a kind of cash job, even the payment is very low, they would like to go to take it. So, but because their family still live in the countryside, so it means that they contribute large amount of labor surplus to the foreign investment factories in coastal area. That is a globalization accelerate the Chinese migrants population, migrants laborers flow out to the cities and the coastal China. That is 1990s. And it means that almost all of these originally, they pay a lot of cost to set up the state industries, ruined out, bankrupted, and large number of the SOE, state-owned enterprises workers lay off. That is late 1990s because of the coastal areas. They have a foreign investments factories, and then can do the foreign trade directly. And most of these factories owned by overseas investors. So in 1990s, it's a big change. And also that's caused by the central have a very low revenue tax from such kind of economic model. So I gave you the curves to show in the mid 1990s, the government's tax decreased to the GDP only 11.5%, very low, much lower than any normal country. It's a very bad thing. Means that the government's budget have no any ability to do the public investments. So that time, the education, the medical service, the hospital system, all became a kind of privatization. And also the governments also have no such kind of surplus, such kind of budget to give to the state-owned enterprises. So these are SOE bankrupted. So at that time, it's destroyed the more times outcome, and created large number of these globalizations industries. So that is a big change. And then to make China accelerating their the process of join the globalization, and to make the big gap between the coastal and the inland China, and to make big gap of rich and the poor. So that is the crisis turned to a lot of new forms, new problems, as Mohanty mentioned, as gender issues, and the aging people, and whatever. And the poor people have no money for paying the very high cost of the medical service. So many things, many bad things happen. So globalization in China is what? It's almost a lot of bad things happen. So and then until the new century, until China reset up the new so key how could say that key events for sustainable development, as inclusive development, and people-centered development, and people-based development, whatever. So that is all set up at the cross of the new century. When China entered the new century, they think that it's a big problem, so they need to deal with. And then the government started to increase large number of the government's debts to do the investments, to turn back. I mean, originally when you follow such kind of regulation, that is a so-called new liberalism economics theory. So you just followed, and then to believe the markets, and then markets can solve everything problems. But from the 1998, Chinese central governments try to encounter this crisis, to take the crisis as a part of a danger, another part is a hope, is opportunity. And then they initiate the budget debts, the government's debts investments, and for the infrastructure construction, mainly by the state-owned enterprises. So from that time, from 1998, China started a new form, a new measures to deal with the crisis. And then we have somehow this so-called Chinese featured socialist model. So that's, if we give you more detailed explanation, we can give you a whole picture, but time is very limited. Just let me stop here. I hope you are interested in such kind of Chinese experiences, alternative explanation. Thank you.